I found a tape of a woman being killed. I was at my grandmother's house, helping my grandmother move furniture around. She became my mother figure after the death of my mother when I was a young child, and I had been staying with her ever since my car accident. My grandmother helped nurse me back into health, so I made an effort to alleviate her of any and all physical tasks. I felt it was the least I could do. It was in the attic, when I accidentally knocked over a box. The box was filled with VHS tapes, with the farthest dating back to 1990. All that was written on them was the year. There was a TV in the attic as well because we used the attic as more like a functioning room than a storage space. So I decided to play the oldest tape. I expected to see happy memories, home videos, sonnery, anything other than this. The video starts with whoever is holding the camera, filming a woman sitting alone at a small table at her coffee shop. She's writing. The camera was zoomed in on her hair glowing in the light. Fixin'. The tape then skips to a new setting. In what looks like downtown Chicago somewhere, I can see the back of the same woman from before, walking down the street, oblivious to the person trailing and filming behind her. The sky is now a dark gray. I can see lights from passing cars glinting off her shiny boots. The camera is clambering and rubbing up against the jacket of the cameraman. He or she's not far from her, but is far enough away to show that he or she's not with her, clearly stalking her. The scene lasted maybe 5 minutes of the monotonous walking until it shifted to the woman now bound and stored in the trunk of a car. She was taped up, unable to speak. All I could hear was the sound of heavy rainfall accompanied by her screaming and crying. Her muffled panic broke my heart in two. My spine became frozen. I couldn't open my eyes any wider. Any moment the film could shift to something so much more grotesque, so morbid, so life-changing, and I could do nothing but watch in horror. I saw a black glove-covered hand sprout from behind the camera, slam the trunk door closed, trapping her inside. It's now clearly night. The next scene skips to the woman, now beaten and bloody while tied to a chair. The location looks to be a warehouse somewhere, the only light coming from a single fluorescent bulb above the woman, illuminating pools of crimson red blood at her feet. The camera is steadily held, so much that it seems to be propped up by a stand. I can hear the poor woman moaning in pain underneath the tape cover in her mouth. I can also hear something shifting around on the concrete, like someone adjusting their stance. It's pneumonic. I could hear clambering of metal, like tools being packed or unpacked from a bag. My stomach now fully turned. The stalker then walks into frame, showing only his back. His head was completely covered in a balaclava. He carried a blood in his right hand. My heart completely halted. The stalker held her drooping head up, tilted her face upward, and began to slice her throat from her left ear all the way to the right. She squirmed and gargled in her desperate and useless attempt to survive. I had never seen so much blood in my life. The killer then takes off his mask and stares into the camera, flashing a toothy grin. The film then abruptly stops. I was held in place by my now shot nerves. My blood slowed into stillness, completely discoloring my body into an almost corpse-like white. My grandmother was watching me. She, shakingly, tried to console me from across the room, struggling to form words through the river of tears streaming down her face. She said she didn't want me to ever be reminded of who I was before my accident. I found a tape of a woman being killed. I was at my grandmother's house, helping my grandmother move furniture around. She became my mother figure after the death of my mother when I was a young child, and I had been staying with her ever since my car accident. My grandmother helped nurse me back into health, so I made an effort to alleviate her of any and all physical tasks. I felt it was the least I could do. It was in the attic, when I accidentally knocked over a box. The box was filled with VHS tapes, with the farthest dating back to 1990. All that was written on them was the year. There was a TV in the attic as well because we used the attic as more like a functioning room than a storage space. So I decided to play the oldest tape. I expected to see happy memories, home videos, sonnery, anything other than this. The video starts with whoever is holding the camera, filming a woman sitting alone at a small table at her coffee shop. She's writing. The camera was zoomed in on her hair glowing in the light. The tape then skips to a new setting. In what looks like downtown Chicago somewhere, I can see the back of the same woman from before, walking down the street, oblivious to the person trailing and filming behind her. The sky is now a dark gray. I can see lights from passing cars glinting off her shiny boots. The camera is clambering and rubbing up against the jacket of the cameraman. He or she's not far from her, but is far enough away to show that he or she's not with her, clearly stalking her. The scene lasted maybe 5 minutes of the monotonous walking until it shifted to the woman now bound and stored in the trunk of a car. She was taped up, unable to speak. All I could hear was the sound of heavy rainfall accompanied by her screaming and crying. Her muffled panic broke my heart in two. My spine became frozen. I couldn't open my eyes any wider. Any moment the film could shift to something so much more grotesque, so morbid, so life-changing, and I could do nothing but watch in horror. I saw a black glove-covered hand sprout from behind the camera, slam the trunk door closed, trapping her inside. It's now clearly night. The next scene skips to the woman, now beaten and bloody while tied to a chair. The location looks to be a warehouse somewhere, the only light coming from a single fluorescent bulb above the woman, illuminating pools of crimson red blood at her feet. The camera is steadily held, so much that it seems to be propped up by a stand. I can hear the poor woman moaning in pain underneath the tape cover in her mouth. I can also hear something shifting around on the concrete, like someone adjusting their stance. It's cinematic. I could hear clambering of metal, like tools being packed or unpacked from a bag. My stomach now fully turned. The stalker then walks into frame, showing only his back. His head was completely covered in a balaclava. He carried a blade in his right hand. My heart completely halted. The stalker held her drooping head up, tilted her face upward, and began to slice her throat from her left ear all the way to the right. She squirmed and gargled in her desperate and useless attempt to survive. I had never seen so much blood in my life. The killer then takes off his mask and stares into the camera, flashing a toothy grin. The film then abruptly stops. I was held in place by my now shot nerves. My blood slowed into stillness, completely discoloring my body into an almost corpse-like white. My grandmother was watching me. She, shakingly, tried to console me from across the room, struggling to form words through the river of tears streaming down her face. She said she didn't want me to ever be reminded of who I was before my accident. My wife bought a reborn doll to cope with the death of our child. My child died after only a month on this earth. I'm going to spare myself the tears on explaining how, but the tears of my wife are ones I'll never forget. Grief is ugly. It's so fucking ugly. When we lost him, it sounded as if my wife was regurgitating fragments of her soul. Her wails could have shattered glass, curdled blood. The cries would turn to screams, screams at the universe, at whichever sick, twisted higher power would let this happen. At herself, at me, she'd scream until the skin of her throat shredded to ribbons. I'll be honest, I didn't cry. I don't remember if I even shed a tear, but not because I wasn't upset. I didn't cry because it felt like she was already doing it for me. No pain is more shared than a grieving mother's cry. I wish there was a handbook on grief, for dummies, if you will, one that could have especially prepared me for the before and the after. Before, you're just waiting, like you're watching an hourglass of life on its last grain. My heart is pumping while he flatlines, and it hits like a wave. I'm going to have to grieve, I thought to myself, before I could even experience it. I thought about how it was coming right for me, and I knew that in the blink of an eye, life was going to be something that I'd have to fight for. Maybe I was already grieving him before he went. Maybe I was prepared, or I just thought I was. I don't think you ever could be prepared. Then, you reach the after, not the moment you leave the hospital room, or even the drive home. It's the moment you open that front door, the air sucked out of the room, and you feel that thorough fucking void. That void in your chest, in your relationship, in your home. This is it. This is my life now. This is real. What hurt even more was that this new life wasn't so foreign to me. It was one I had nearly a month ago. I felt so guilty for not grieving him, but instead grieving for what he could have been. I grieved for the first birthday and dozens after it. The first steps, the graduations. I'd even trade a hormonal team fight with him over this. I couldn't help but grieve the life he could have had instead of the one we lost. My wife felt differently. She missed their skin touching, humming to him, even dragging herself out of bed at 3 a.m. because he was crying again. We never really discussed it, but we could just tell that we were grieving down 2 separate paths. Our backs were always turned in bed. She'd flinch when I'd touch her. It was as if she was allergic to me. But I understood she needed her space. The funeral was absolute hell on earth. Actually, I think rotting in the fiery pits of hell would feel better than attending an infant's funeral. At least it'd be warm, unlike the icy grip of mourning. I remember walking up to the casket alone, staring down at him, and all I could think was, casket shouldn't be that small. He laid in a box that was small enough to cradle in my arms. When they lowered him into the ground, the cries emerged again. My wife wailed into the clear morning sky, so guttural it was as if it was happening all over again. But she didn't collapse into my arms. She collapsed to the ground, as if she wanted to join him. Then you open the front door again and the voids are even deeper. Everything is even realer. We packed up our child's nursery and his future into boxes, then fought about whether or not to throw it all out. She said she wanted them in the attic. I said I'd never be able to go up there again if we did, so we just left it all in that room, collecting dust. The door stayed shut at all times, but never locked, just closed. I think it symbolized our grief. In a way, we closed the door on that part of our lives, but weren't ready to lock it away forever. Each day doesn't get easier, it just gets farther away from the day it happened. The mornings are the worst. You wake up, your eyes creak open, the morning sun is pouring through your window, and then you remember that you're grieving, as if you could forget. Little things began to tick us off. One of us would forget to do the dishes, and it'd end up with someone sleeping on the couch or taking a long midnight drive. We tried couples therapy, but we needed so much more therapy than that. It wasn't even about us. It was about him. The wedge was him. I was at my wit's end with how to deal with this. but it appeared that my wife was one step ahead of me when I heard a soft humming from our bedroom after I came home from work. My brows furrowed as I made my way upstairs. The last time I heard her hum this tune was at the hospital, right before the heart rate monitor hummed back. When I pushed the cracked open door, I felt like I was dreaming. She was laying in our bed, cradling a baby in her arms, looking down at it like she could see every planet, every star, every galaxy. I remember pinching my thigh as I stared at her, the slight pain stinging. She was so engrossed by it. I could have stood there till the end of time, and she wouldn't have noticed. Hey, Tunin. She finally looked up. Oh, hi. She stretched a smile that had become so foreign. Oh, what are you holding? Hold this. It's a reborn doll. I raised a brow at her. They're realistic dolls for mothers too, to help me. Help. She nodded rapidly, her smile weakening. It was as if I had disrupted the fantasy just by asking. Oh, I couldn't help but stare at it. And stare at her because of the way she'd stare at it, as if she was holding her own flesh and blood and not plastic. How's it? Help. I've only had it for a few hours now, but it's comforting. It rubbed me the wrong way at first, but if nothing else was working, I was glad if this would. Do you want to hold him? Suddenly, I felt myself at a crossroads. I didn't know if I could hold a doll and give her the reaction she wanted. I can't look at it like it's my son, but I knew that this wasn't just about me, so I hesitantly walked over and stretched my arms out. A slight chill ran down my spine as its cold skin was placed onto my palms. I pulled it close and cradled it, staring down at it, and suddenly, I crumbled into tears. It felt too fucking real. I dropped to my knees as it laid in my shaking arms, my scrunched face already wet. I knew it wasn't actually my son, but I realized how much I missed this, not just the moments we lost. My wife patiently waited as I wailed with my head hung. I let out cries I never knew I could, my voice cracking with each ugly sob. After that day, I noticed things getting better. It didn't fill the voids, but something else stood inside of them for a while, just to keep them dormant. Whenever she had one of those days where standing on her own 2 foot didn't feel worth it, she'd hold it, hum to it. Sometimes she'd pretend to breastfeed it. I will admit it still creeped me out to some extent. It was comforting in a way, but I knew it wasn't him, and I think this is when the wedge grew deeper. One day I came home, and as I walked upstairs, my entire body locked as I saw light leaking out of a door. That door, I knew it was unlocked, but I never expected either of us to ever open it. At least not so soon. I swallowed roughly as I approached it. Slowly opening the door revealed empty boxes and a full nursery. She had set up everything again. I observed the room as I stepped in, a feeling of concern weighing on me. Then, I noticed something in the crib. I wrapped my fingers around the railing and leaned in, my brows furrowing as I saw the doll laying. I didn't hear you come on. My body jolted as I whipped around. Jesus, that's sorry. You, what is this? What is this? Oh, our nursery. Well, yes, but why is everything unboxed? Our baby is in nursery. We stared at each other with accusations of insanity. I've researched this, dolls, and I understand how this helps you. I'll admit, it's helped me a bit too. What this? You know this isn't our what? Suddenly I was tongue-tied. I'm just concerned. I unpacked all of this myself. I'll put it all back when I want to. Okay, she said slowly and sternly, daggers shooting from her eyes. I could feel a million words crawling up my throat, but the only thing that came out was, okay, I think I need some alone time with him. I nodded, looking away as I slipped past her. I was trying to be patient with her. I really was, but I just couldn't meet her at the lengths she was going, pretending this is our kid may help her. But it only made me feel worse. That night, not a word was exchanged under those sheets. I was turned towards the window, and she was turned towards the baby monitor that she put new batteries in. After making faces out of the moon, I eventually fell asleep. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, I felt myself drift away from my dream and wake up. My eyes slowly creaked open, the dim moonlight coming through the window. The room was silent, except for the cries that came through the baby monitor. I sat up and rubbed my eyes, staring at the monitor as staticky cries emitted from the speaker. Limps, W, wake up. I shook my wife till she groaned out of her slumber. She lifted her sleeping mask and looked at the monitor. My eyes darted towards her, then back at the monitor. She sighed, tossed her mask onto the dresser and stood up. I'll handle him. Get some sleep. I stared at her wide-eyed. My throat knotted as she tiredly walked out of the room. As she stepped into the nursery, I began to hear her over the speaker. It's okay. I blinked like a deer in headlights as I listened to her hum, the crying slowing to a stop. My eyes shifted towards the door as she walked back in, grabbed her sleeping mask, and laid back down. She didn't say a word as I just continued to stare. A part of me wanted to go into the nursery, but I just laid there till my eyes dried and ran bloodshot. Before I knew it, the sun was up and I had to go to work. I slowly stood up and stiffly got ready. I tried to convince myself that it was a dream, but I had already woken up from one. When I finished getting dressed, I kissed her as she slept and left the room. As I passed the nursery, I paused for a moment. At first, I considered going on, but instead I pressed my ear against the door, but there was nothing, just absolute silence. I don't know what I thought I was going to hear. I didn't even know what I heard last night. I couldn't tell if hearing something now would have made me feel more or less insane. That day at work was grueling. I kept falling asleep at my desk. Had a hard time processing what people were even saying to me. It was just one big blur. When I got home, the first thing I wanted to ask my wife was what the fuck happened last night. But after the incident in the nursery, I feared she'd tell me that the doll crying is normal because it's our son. When I got home, I was ready to fall flat on my face. My wife stood at the sink washing dishes, her head turning as I walked in. Hey, hon, hi, how was work? You know, the usual. Be quiet when you go upstairs. I just put him down and it wasn't without a fight. She chuckled. I'll be sure not to waken him. I anxiously cleared my throat as she quickly glared at me, then looked away. At least I was trying to play along. I quietly walked upstairs, minimizing the creaks of each step. As I passed the door, I could feel my breathing and heartbeat halt to a stop. Something about it just always knocked the wind out of me. Dinner was so silent. You could hear a pin falling before it even dropped. Chewing and sipping filled the dense quiet. I was thinking of taking him to a mommy and me class. I looked up, my chewing slowed. Is that? Sounds good. I bit my tongue and smiled. I couldn't tell if she was being serious or if she just wanted to talk. I also wish you'd spend more time with him. You avoid the nursery like the plague. She laughed weakly. I'll make sure to do that. Thank you, watching her eat. The look on her face. I could tell she could barely get the food down her throat. She was trying. She was really fucking trying. I felt guilty for not being more understanding. It was hard to accept that we were just going to be grieving in different ways no matter what. But I was at a crossroads when it felt like our grief couldn't help each other. But the one thing that was itching at the back of my mind was last night. It was crying. How could it be crying? It didn't seem to surprise her either. I tried to make any logical reasoning for it. Maybe she set an alarm with a baby crying sound. Or if there's a speaker inside of it, something to make it feel realer. It was possible, except for one other thing. It sounded so much like him if you're not a parent. A baby crying is just a baby crying. But I could pick out those cries from a crowd. Maybe it's just grief playing mind games. I couldn't tell. Later that night, after brushing my teeth, I was walking to our bedroom when I noticed my wife in the nursery. She was slowly rocking back and forth in the rocking chair, humming to it. Hey, I finally got him to sleep, she said after noticing me hovering in the doorway. That's good. Come say goodnight. I stared for a moment before forcing myself to enter the room. She stood up and walked over to the crib, then gently placed it down. She leaned down, kissed his forehead, then turned to me. I glanced at her, then at it. I could tell she was expecting me to do the same. I hesitantly leaned towards it. My lips puckered. Suddenly, as I got closer, a pungent smell entered my nostrils. I tried to ignore it, but I recoiled as I got closer, the foul stench growing stronger. My wife glared at me in horror as I gagged, clasping my hand to my mouth. What the fuck is wrong with you? I am sorry. Him nodded. Him, okay. He smells like a fucking dumpster fire. What? Does he have belt and fecal mechanics too? Tears welled in her eyes as I looked away with guilt. My entire body shaking. Just admit that this is a joke to you. You think I'm embarrassing myself, that I'm crazy. Just say it. Liv, no. Actually, don't. Just sleep somewhere else tonight. The couch, the fucking sidewalk. I don't care. Okay. I flew out of the room before I could burst into tears of fury. I felt like such a fucking monster. Prioritizing both of our healing was just tearing me apart. It was tearing us apart. I curled up on the couch and screamed into the pillow, leaving tear stains on the cover. I sobbed until it exhausted me, eventually knocking me out. All of a sudden, I was ripped from my slumber at the sound of glass shattering, my body jolting awake. I quickly sat up, my eyes darting around in a blur, throwing the blanket off of me. I stood up and searched for the source of the sound. The room was pitch black as I ran my hand along the walls to find a light switch. Suddenly, my eyes shot open as something sharp impaled the bottom of my foot. Fuck, Seb, I hissed to myself as I lifted my foot. Now I was hopping around till I found a light switch, while also avoiding glass that I could not see. Eventually, I found one and illuminated the kitchen. I looked down at my foot. A small train of blood drops behind me. I lifted it up, blood leaking down my skin. It was a small shard of porcelain, so I pursed my lips, took a deep breath, bit my cheek and yanked it out. I swallowed a scream as I placed the crimson-coated shard on the kitchen counter. Then, I noticed some white powder on the bottom of my foot as well. I limped around the kitchen, soon finding a shattered cookie jar and an open flour bag spilled across the floor. God fucking damn it. I quickly tied an unused dish rag around my foot and began picking up the shards. The stress of the cut and the mess overshadowed the thought of how it even fell in the first place. But this thought came front and center when I noticed small flour-coated footprints leaving out of the kitchen. I slowly placed the last shard in the trash as my eyes stared under furrowed brows. I limped over and knelt down, observing them closely. They looked like, no, impossible. I told myself it was impossible, But who else could have feet that small? It wasn't my wife, and it wasn't an animal. An uneasiness clouded over me as I quickly vacuumed it up. The trail was longer than I realized as I exited the kitchen and made my way through the living room. Eventually, I reached the stairs. Noticing the footprints one up them too, my eyes slowly glided up, then stared deeply into the dark hallway. I was able to at least try and logically explain the crying the other night, but I couldn't make anything of this. I took a deep breath and slowly made my way upstairs. With each footprint that vanished into the vacuum added one more beat to my pounding heart. When I reached the top step, I realized the trail led even farther. I continued to follow it, taking the curve it took that ended at a door. That door, I slowly stood up, my heavy, shaking breaths hitting the wood, but I couldn't bring myself to go in. I just wanted to cry, feeling like I was being haunted by my own grief. I could have been standing there for a minute or an hour. Either way, it felt like forever before I finally stepped away and entered the bathroom. I held back tears as I made sure there wasn't any glass left in my foot, then properly bandaged it. With everything that had happened and was happening, all I could think was, why us? Why me? I just wanted to be a husband, a father, a family. Why does life's unfairness have to be so cruel? It's more than just not getting what you want. It's losing what you love. It's your son dying after only a month of being. It's not unfair. It's just cruel. So fucking cruel. After securing the bandage, I limped out of the bathroom, my body weighing with exhaustion. Then, I halted in front of the nursery door, my eyes scrunching shut as the sound of crying suddenly came from behind it. Never in my life have I prayed, not even for my son. It felt like shouting into a void, but at that moment, I prayed for it to end. I needed it to end, but nobody was listening. Life wasn't that fair. I should have known that. I opened my eyes, tears welling in them, and kept walking past it. The cries grew fainter as there was a ceiling between us, but I could still hear them. I could feel them crying for daddy as I laid my heavy head on the couch pillow. I had hoped that my wife would wake up and deal with it, but she never did. The entire night I lay there, the tears drying against my cheeks as it relentlessly cried. My psyche was shattering piece by piece as it grew impossible to even keep a grasp on reality, or try and figure out what the fuck was going on while its screams filled my ears and bounced around in my skull. At that point, I just wanted to die, or to at least just be numb, to have the ability to not give a single fuck about anything happening, even if just for 5 seconds, would have helped me sleep that night. By the time it was morning, the crying had stopped at some point, but I don't remember when. Jack, my wife suddenly said, her hand resting on my shoulder. I jolted, my head whipping towards her. Didn't mind Iscario, it's fine. I just didn't sleep. I could see guilt hanging on her expression. Is everything alright? I want to apologize for last night. You've been very patient with me, and I feel like I've been asking you for more than you can handle. We paused in silence for a moment, our eyes shifting around each other. I appreciate him. I'm sorry. Too, I've been too judgmental. We don't have to be on the same page to care about each other. She sat down next to me and rested her head on my shoulder. I kissed the top of her head and enjoyed the quiet with her. I wanted to bring up what I saw last night, but figured now wasn't the right time. And about the smell, you went wrong. I went to go see him this morning, and it hit me like a truck. She chuckled weakly. Turns out, he was molding on the inside, which can happen, apparently. I reached out to the seller and she said that it happens due to poor upkeep. Suddenly, she broke into tears, collapsing into my chest. I held her close as her tears soaked through my shirt. How did I manage to lose him twice? My heart shattered. It's okay. It's okay. You can always get a new one. No, I can't. I looked into her eyes with deep concern. Olivia, can we speak honestly for a moment? With no hard feelings. She slowly nodded. It's a go. You can get a new one. Even then, I pushed the wrong buttons as she ripped herself from my arms and stormed upstairs. You don't get it. You never did. You know what? No, that's not fucking fair. None of this is fucking fair. Before I could get another word in, she was already in our bedroom, the door slamming behind her. I buried my face in my hands as I drew deep, slow breaths. Everyone always said grief brings people together, but all this is doing is tearing everything apart. My marriage, myself, my understanding of what's real and what isn't. I spent another work day in a complete daze. I even got reprimanded by my boss for lack of work ethic. When I got home, I was met with a distraught wife. She was definitely still mad at me, so I considered whether or not to even ask if she was okay. Hey, hon, are you alright? I threw him out. Oh, I'm so sorry. Are you? Lips, surprised you didn't say thank God. Look, I am sorry about this morning, but I'm trying, and I know you know that, but it's hard when you keep flying off the handle. Babe, want to see somebody? The grief counselor. He was my grief counselor. That's why I'm getting another one. Just like you said. Right. Whatever works for you. I smiled weakly. She sipped her coffee with a daze in her eye, like she could see something that wasn't there. Just by looking at her, you could tell she was dangling at the edge. But I couldn't pry and prod anymore. For her sake and mine, she let me sleep in our bed that night. but we didn't exchange any more words than goodnight. I could feel the back of her ankles against my legs. At some point, she even turned towards me in her sleep. But she didn't want to touch me. She needed just enough space, and I let her have it. The night without her in the house gave me the best sleep I had gotten since he died. I woke up feeling refreshed for once, but I quickly noticed the emptiness next to me. She must have gotten up early. As I left the bedroom, my brows furrowed as I heard humming from behind the nursery door. My puzzled expression twisted further as I saw my wife cradling it in her arms. "Good morning." "Hi." "Thought you had to get rid of him." "Good morning." And I did. "This is the new one." She smiled. "Well, already so fast," expressed sipping. She shrugged with a chuckle. "Sweet, I'm gonna try and put him down for his nap. Could you brew me a cup?" "Yeah, sure." I smiled before closing the door behind me. The second she couldn't see me anymore, I stood absolutely baffled. Something about her just seemed, well, how could she have gotten a new one that quickly? It didn't add up. She had gotten so attached to it. The thought of her wanting to keep it, no matter the mold, didn't surprise me. What hurt the most is that she'd lied to me. After filling the steaming mugs, I set them down at the table and read the news on my phone as I waited for her to come down. He didn't put up a fight. Thank God. She sighed with relief as she trotted downstairs. "That's good." I sipped my coffee, keeping my eyes on the screen. She sat across from me, taking slow sips as she stared off at a daze again. I occasionally glanced up at her, watching her tap her finger against the mug and bite her cheek. "Are you alright?" She laughed at the question, circling her finger around the rim of the mug. "Weather's nice today." She responded, "It is. Maybe you should spend some time outside. You could take him out for a walk." "Yeah, that sounds nice." Her words trailed off like she was dreaming. I helped her take out the baby carriage that we never got to use and watched with unease as she laid the doll in it. "Hope you two have a nice time." I smiled. "We'll be back soon." We quickly kissed before she was out the door. And finally, I could breathe. It was only a mere few hours, but it was still time to breathe. It was also time to think. The past few nights, I had experienced things that were beyond what I thought grief would be like. I knew it'd be haunting, but not like this. I never really believed in the supernatural. I'd say I'm a skeptical person, but after the constant crying, the footprints, I couldn't make any logic out of it. I'd run in circles to death before it made any actual sense. And my wife seems to know more than she's letting on, but I was scared that one more question would push her out the door. I couldn't lose her, too, but now our grief wasn't just going down two different paths. It was going in completely opposite directions. She needed the doll to heal, and I needed it gone to heal, but I didn't know how to get rid of it without hurting her in the process. I thought about tossing it and making her believe she misplaced it, but that just felt cruel. I didn't need to put her under any more distress. By the time she got back, I hadn't really moved off of square one. I still understood nothing. I figured out nothing. I was just aching even more. "Are you feeling better?" "Yeah, it was nice to get some sun. This little guy enjoyed it, too." Dento, she gushed. I couldn't help but feel so uncomfortable watching her treat it like it was our son. But it's her way of coping, and I had to respect that, to at least put myself at some ease. I told myself that I'm just under a lot of stress, and that my grieving mind is just playing tricks on me. I guess being tormented by him was better than never seeing him again. That night, she laid close to me, our legs intertwined as she fell asleep against me, her arm across my chest. I missed her warmth so much, I thought his death had cooled her touch. But she was still so warm, so comforting. It was easy falling asleep that night with her against me, like a child and their favorite stuffed animal. But I was stupid to forget that life isn't unfair. It's cruel. In the middle of the night, I was awoken by the cries over the baby monitor again. Only this time, as my eyes opened, I realized I couldn't move anything else. My heart pounded as I drew in panicked breaths. My jaw merely trembled as I attempted to speak. Pleas for help caught in my throat. A tear streamed down the side of my face as I waited for my wife to wake up. But she didn't. I was locked on that bed, unable to do nothing but listen to its cries. I wanted to scream, sob, punch a fucking wall, but I could do absolutely nothing. Suddenly, the speaker cut out, its cries halting with a static screech. My trembling breaths filled the silent room as my body stayed frozen on the bed. I couldn't even squeeze out a groan to try and wake her. Then, the sound of a door creaking open came from the hallway, and the cries began again. Not over the speaker, but from the hallway. Its cries sounded distorted. They were deeper, more drawn out, and they sent goosebumps from head to toe. I scrunched my eyes as I begged to be able to move, the crying nearing closer. Then, the bedroom door slowly opened, the deep cries filling up the room. I looked over at my wife, who was somehow still asleep. I wondered if this was even happening outside of my own head. I couldn't see it, but I could tell it was moving closer, and with each step its cries grew deeper. It reached the point that it sounded like it was gargling on its own blood. When it stood by my ear, its sobs were deafening. Now, I couldn't move, and I couldn't hear anything besides this suffocating, dizzying crying that made me feel like I was drowning in molten tar. Tada, it gurgles, and just like that, I felt my entire body unlock. and a scream worth 1,000 screams exited my mouth like a dam breaking open. The sound waves rippled my throat as I scatteredly threw myself off the bed and into the corner of the room. "Jesus Christ," my wife shouted as she finally woke up, ripping off her sleeping mask and turning the lamp on. I let out wails of pure terror as I balled up in the corner, my body tremoring. "My God, what happened?" I eyed him as I could barely squeeze a word out in between sobs. "Jesus." She hopped off the bed and kneeled next to me, my body flinching as she reached for me. "What happened?" I slowly turned to her, my eyes gaping wide. Instead of saying a word, I stumbled to my feet and made my way out of the bedroom. "Where are you going? What happened?" "Jack." I ignored her calls as I threw the nursery door open. My eyes darted around as I searched for it, then realized it was in the crib. "Jack, what are you doing?" "I'm not doing this anymore." "Jack, can we talk about this?" She gasped in horror as I yanked it out of the crib. "You're right, Olivia. This isn't a goal. This is a fucking parasite. And I want a gun." "Jack, please. That's our son." "No, it's fucking not." She winced as I screamed. "Stop it, please," she begged, tears pouring down her face as I began rapidly shaking it in front of her face. "Yes, Hyacinth, Howard, son." Then, in one final burst of rage, I gripped it by his throat and slammed it to the ground with all of my might. In this moment, I realized that I learned two things from the death of my son. Caskets aren't supposed to be that small, and reborn dolls aren't supposed to have internal organs. My wife crumbled to her knees as she let out those cries, the ones I could never forget. My breathing and heartbeat practically stopped, my body shutting down for a moment as I stared down at the spilled, graying organs and mushy skin that she attempted to cup in her trembling hands. I slowly looked up at her, utter horror hanging on my expression. "Olivia, what is this? He didn't belong down there. He belongs with me, with us." I think my grandmother made a profit off of me as a kid. When I was a little one, my grandmother had kept poor company. However, when I was just a kid, my grandmother was my hero because she had a pool in her backyard and would take me to Disney World even during the school year so I would be able to just not go to school. She bought me gifts and even got a cat at her house that I took care of. All this to say, my grandmother bought my love through these extravagant gifts, and since I was just a tot, I fell for a hook, line, and sinker. Now, the actual story is pertaining to the company my grandmother kept. She herself was a self-proclaimed born-again Christian, so I suppose it made sense that she chose these people as her friends. I didn't realize this at the time, but she seemed to have a thing for child predators, to the point where she even hung out with them while I was visiting her for the weekend. Now, I have been told that I was an extremely adorable little girl, bright blonde ringlet curls, gray eyes. I even had several photos of when I was a kid modeling for children's clothes. So, whenever I would visit, there was always a creepo visiting her, and she would always leave me alone with them to run errands. This would take upwards of an hour. Nothing explicitly sexual would happen, I don't think. Then again, I could be blocking out these memories since it started off when I was about 5 years old. No, these men would bite, nibble, lick, and sniff my feet of all things. I don't know why I didn't say anything sooner, but eventually I told my mother that I don't like it when grandma leaves me alone with the weird men. They would always lick my feet and I didn't like it. It wasn't long after that I didn't see my grandmother for nearly 10 years. So again, I'm pretty sure my grandmother sold off my little kid feet to these weird pedophiles. And yes, I'm in therapy because of the things she allowed to happen to me and because of the other things she's done. Edit. I honestly thought this post would get lost in new. Thank you all for your kind words. It's enough to put a woman to tears, but I promise I'm fine. And if I'm not, well, at least I'm medicated and going to therapy along with a strong support system. Also, thank you, kind stranger, for the silver. I had conversations with my brother before I found out he died week before. Dead relative. Updated. This is the first time I'm actually writing about this. So when I was 13, my older brother and I were on our way to a movie when we were hit by a drunk driver. I woke up in hospital 4 days later, having lost my right leg, another leg, and cast along with other injuries. That night I woke up to my brother sitting by my bed telling me everything will be okay and to go back to sleep. Next day, parents came to visit and see how I was doing. I asked why my brother wasn't with them, and they looked at each other but didn't say anything. That night I again woke up to brother sitting by my bed again telling me he knows I can get through this, and I need to be strong and overcome this and not let my injuries stop me from living life. We talked a bit, him not answering specific questions, but answering more general questions. Remember asking him why he was still wearing clothes from yesterday because that was very unlike him to wear anything similar to what he wore the day before. He didn't answer that, but when asked how he said better than he thought he would be given the circumstances. He reminded me to be strong and keep living, and not let anything stop me, and how much he loved me before telling me I should get some more sleep. That next day parents again came to visit me in hospital, and I again asked why brother wasn't with them. and they again looked at each other, and it was only after I said that I would like family visit together, and not at different times, and would like brother could visit during day when we can talk more, instead of at night, that my dad asked what I meant. When I told him Andy had been coming at night to visit, my mom broke down and left the room. My dad then told me that was impossible because Andy died in an accident instantly. I didn't believe it and argued it and ended up having to be sedated. That night I had no visit, and next day parents brought newspaper article about the accident. Years later, my fiance had an experience, and having never seen a photo of my brother, she described him to a T and what he was wearing. That is a story for another time. But it was nice knowing brother is still around and looking out for me and those I love. I learned a new skill, and it cost me everything. I only signed up for the experimental education program because I was desperate. I'd been out of a job for 4 months, and I had no savings left. I was going to be homeless in a matter of weeks. So I started lying on my resume. I put whatever I thought companies wanted to see. Eventually, I scored an interview, and they actually gave me the job after I confidently walked in and bullshitted my way through. A handshake sealed the deal. I would be making 200 grand a year working with peptides. The only problem, I was due to start in 2 days, and I had no idea what peptides even were, let alone how to work with them. My whole life was about to implode. So, naturally, I sat around drinking beer and scrolling the internet all Saturday night. It was there that I saw a sidebar ad for the experimental education program. They claimed that, using virtual reality, I could learn a new skill in under 3 minutes. Not just a new skill, but any skill, regardless of complexity. Right, impassable, sure, drunkenly, I responded to their ad with an email, asking if I could learn molecular biology in under 3 minutes. It was 2 a.m. on a Saturday night, but I received an immediate response from a Dr. Jensen, claiming that, yes, that was possible. Right, sure, rolling my eyes. I signed up for one of their prototype trials the following morning. I woke hungover that Sunday morning to an alarm that my past self had set. It read learn molecular biology 12:15. God, really? Well, I had nothing to lose. I dragged myself out of bed, showered in a funk, and drove out to the offices of experimental education, parking outside that nondescript office building near downtown. I remained ready to bolt at the first sign of a multi-level marketing scam. The parking lot was astoundingly solitary and lonely under that gray drizzling overcast, which I took, paradoxically, as a good sign if there had been dozens of other people heading in. Then we were all probably marks for some PowerPoint pitch. As I approached, a bespectacled older man in a white lab coat stepped out of the automatic glass doors through his medical mask. He said, "You're late." I looked at my cell phone. It's 12:16. The process only takes 3 minutes. He chided me. That could have been a third of another appointment if we were fully booked. Oh, shit, sorry. I awkwardly followed him into the building without further protest. The halls within were standard Art Deco, and had definitely been rented by his team rather than built for this purpose. I might have even been there before for something else years ago. It was impossible to tell. He showed me through a door, where an office full of medical equipment waited next to 2 inpatient nurses. They were both wearing masks, just like the doctor, but I was not. I reached in my pockets, pretending to look for a mask, but they ignored my attempt to save face. One nurse guided me to the central chair, while the other prepared a syringe of neon green liquid. It was the doctor himself who handed me a clipboard with several sheets of paper on it. I briefly scanned it, noticing some medical terms and molecular biology written in cursive halfway, but he shoved a red pen in my hand. I asked, "Is this the waiver?" "It's the contract." He said flatly, "You're already late. Please just sign it." Both nurses stopped and stared at me, feeling intensely pressured. I awkwardly wrote my signature and read on the bottom, and handed it back to him. He stashed the clipboard, then returned with a helmet that looked straight out of a science fiction B-movie, confused by its colorful lights and exposed technological hardware. I asked, "Is that the virtual reality helmet?" As he slid it on over my head, he said, "No Matrix jokes, please." My senses went black as the helmet covered my eyes, ears, and nose. Where are the controls? Nobody answered me. Instead, I felt a jab in my arm. I could only figure that the nurse was injecting me with that neon green liquid, but it was too late to ask why. A white light appeared in my vision, first as an intense dot, but then expanding into an all-encompassing flare that simultaneously numbed me and made me feel like I was rising out of my body. Heat noodled every inch of me, and then I sat up. I was in a white-walled room only slightly bigger than my college dorm room back in the day. The bed underneath me was thin and uncomfortable. Had something gone wrong? Had they brought me somewhere else to recover? I shakily stood, finding myself clothed in a basic white shirt and basic white pants. Both were thin, like hospital gown material. A nearby sink was made of white porcelain, and I walked over to it. No mirror. I think that was what first tipped me off. Mirrors were a processing cost that most games weren't willing to pay, and it was even harder in virtual reality, where the coders could never guess what the protagonist looked like in real life. The next thing that tipped me off, there was no door. There was no actual way to enter or leave the white walled room. The only other thing present was a white table stacked with books. Out loud, I said, "Holy crap, am I in virtual reality right now?" My voice sounded normal. My hands and arms seemed to be my own. My legs even ached a little, but this was virtual reality. It was insanely good. I actually felt like myself, just cast into a new environment. Maybe the injection had been some sort of hallucinogen. Maybe the helmet's visuals weren't really this good, but I was perceiving them as realistic. If that was the case, then learning a new skill might be difficult. I approached the table and sat in the only other furniture in the room, which was, of course, a white chair. The books were all thick texts pertaining to molecular biology. Okay then, this was what I'd signed up for. This was what I needed, and it looked like it was really happening. Opening the first book, I started reading. It was heady and complex stuff that tired my brain quickly. After about half a chapter, I sighed, looked around, and decided to take a break. Screw it, nap time. I'd awoke in a blink, feeling as if I'd never slept at all. That wasn't good. I returned to my textbook and made it through to the end of the first chapter. Okay, I now vaguely knew how a cell worked. I was feeling better, actually, which I chalked up to my hangover fading. I continued on to another chapter before breaking from the textbook with bleary eyes. Time to eat. I stood and looked around. No food. Simulating hunger was a new thing I'd never expected, and I was honestly wondering why they'd programmed that in without providing any food. I turned on the sink, but the water that came out was black and stank of rotten eggs. Mortified, I shook my head and backed away. I reclined on the bed and slept again, but I woke up with a start, feeling like only a split second had passed. The only indicator that time had passed was that the rotten egg smell had faded. I was still hungry and tired. As great as this simulation was, it was terrible in certain very fundamental ways. Maybe that was up to me to point out when I gave feedback. After all, this was a prototype. I returned to my textbooks, pushing through what learning I could, until my hunger, thirst, and tiredness became too distracting. It created something amazing here, and I was indeed learning molecular biology. But was I supposed to read this entire stack of textbooks while starving, parched, and sleep deprived? I needed to do this for my new job, so I kept at it, forcing myself to focus. I actually finished reading and understanding the first entire textbook before the screaming inside my body became too overwhelming to continue. Maybe the information from the single textbook I'd read would be enough to fake my way through a Monday morning. I had to give up on this. Stand on. I tried to speak. Instead, I coughed. I hadn't spoken in how long? I couldn't tell. After a few more coughs, I said weakly, "I'd like to leave now." Nothing happened. In the simulation, still nothing. Okay, computer. Freeze program. Nope. I shouted. Existence is paused. Just silence in white. The long shot quote had failed. My heart hammered painfully in my chest as I began to realize that there was no way out. I'd entered this experiment to learn molecular biology, and that was what I was going to have to do. As I sat and forced myself to read, I started fearing a time limit. My body was slowly but surely getting weaker and shrinking from starvation. The hunger burned, making me aware of the very engine of life inside myself as it consumed calories. I wasn't dying, because this wasn't real, but the thirst was driving me mad. I turned on the sink a few times, desperate to drink the black water that stank of rotten eggs, but I couldn't make myself do it even in the darkest depths of my agony. Sleep was pointless. I became a husk. I sat, I studied textbooks, and I flipped pages slowly with emaciated fingers. That was all I was, for what felt like months. It wasn't enough to read the textbooks. I had to understand them, too. Learning while mostly insane from hunger and thirst, and insomnia felt like a monumental task. I was certain that I was never going to escape. The program would never end. This would be it for me, forever. I spent an entire week screaming. To no avail. I raged at the walls, chipping away at them, just uncovering more white plaster. I was perpetually dying, but never actually ceasing to exist. I broke the sink, and black rotten egg water spewed onto the floor, then down a hard-to-see white drain. I sat in a stench, my feet wet, and continued to learn. What other choice did I have? This was never going to end. I flipped through the pages for eternity, truly giving up on the concept of escaping, right up until I closed the final book, when the helmet lifted away and I found myself in that room with 2 nurses and the doctor again. I sat in a disbelieving daze. The doctor asked, "How was it?" I stared down. My hands were normal again. My arms had their former strength. I touched my face, finding that I was not a husk. Wide-eyed, I fixated on his question. It was horrible. I was starving and thirsty and tired the entire time. He nodded. That's a manifestation of the cost of thinking so rapidly. You just experienced 7 months of intense thought and learning in 3 minutes. He nodded at the empty syringe on the nurse's hand. That liquid we injected you with contained concentrated neurochemicals, electrolytes, vitamins, and the like. We were hoping it would lessen the pain involved. I grabbed his arm. It was the worst thing I've ever been through. Yes, but did you learn molecular biology like you wanted? Thinking it through, I realized I had. Then not to success. All that's left is refining the technology. I let go of his arm and grimaced apologetically, rising shakily. I wandered for the door. They didn't even let me toward the front of the building. The three just went about their business, readying the room for their next subject. I wasn't even sure how I got home. I just lay there all evening and all night, staring at the ceiling as intense trauma rushed around the edges of my awareness. When my alarm went off to wake me up for my first day of work, I was still just lying there with open eyes. But I did no molecular biology. I was already dressed. I just dragged myself up, drove to my new office, and floated through my first day at my new job. They gave me some training, and I actually understood the science. What I didn't understand was how experimental education's technology was even possible. The naive young version of me that had gone into that machine would never have questioned the fundamental technologies at play. But they just forcefully taught me everything I needed to know all day long, instead of doing my job. I thought about just how powerful that neon green liquid would have to have been to do what they claimed. The brain was the most expensive engine in the human body, and running it for 7 months would require far more than a syringe, no matter how densely packed the contents. That night, I remained awake, still staring at the ceiling. I hadn't slept in 7 months. So closing my eyes and trying to do it still felt unnatural. The nightmare I'd gone through felt simultaneously like an eternity and a mere instant. I just kept coming back to the same question. How? I tried to ignore that persistent question. And I did manage to take some fitful naps filled with flashback sensations to that white-walled room. But I only made it 2 more days before I couldn't take it any longer. That Wednesday night, I drove back to that office long after it had closed. The front door was locked, but the signs for experimental education were still up. Returning to my car and fetching a tire iron and a bag, I carefully crept around the corner, along the shadowed side of the building, and toward the back. There in the darkest and quietest corner of the alley, I found a low window that would serve. Was I really going to do this? I had to know. The tire iron shattered the window with just a light tap. I winced. Somewhere, a dog barked. I waited, but nobody human seemed to have noticed the sound of fallen glass, stealing my resolve. I carefully lowered myself into the basement. In the dark, I felt my way past stacked chairs, tables, and other generic office equipment. Nearing the dim light of the stairwell, I felt something soft, warm, and wet. It was fabric, but it was a person. He groaned, and I hurriedly backed up, standing there in the dark. I waited, terrified. I was busted for sure. Someone had found me, right, when he didn't say anything. I sensed that something was wrong in a very different way than I'd expected. Moving further, I found a light switch, then turned around to look. A tan-skinned man of vaguely Middle Eastern appearance was hanging by both arms from 2 thick chains embedded in the ceiling. He was wearing a black business suit that had been sullied by assault, and long trails of blood, both dried and fresh, ran from his head, ears, and neck. It was immediately obvious that someone had beaten this man half to death and chained him here in the basement of this office building. But knowing that only made me even more frightened. He blinked awake, and his eyes settled on me. I would have expected him to seem hopeful, but his gaze held only defeated apathy. Noticing his silence, I moved forward and pulled a bald cloth from inside his mouth. He spit blood, then looked at me with sullen askance. I prompted, do you need help? I couldn't place his accent. He said simply, release more. Yeah, of course. I said quickly, I'll go get help. No, he responded wearily. Sorry, what? You don't want me to get the police. You have to make the choice to release me yourself. I hesitated. What the hell does that mean? Of all the responses he could have given, I didn't expect a laugh. His tired snicker echoed throughout the basement, setting me on edge. There was something very, very wrong here. Something very, very wrong with him. I had no idea what his relation was to experimental education, if he even had one. But I backed away with an increasing urge to run. He just stared at me, never blinking. I found the stairwell and stumbled my way up, keeping my eyes on him as long as I could. When I finally closed the stairwell door quietly behind me, a palpable primal fear drained out of me. Something about that chained man had frightened me in a way that was deeper than logic, and deeper than mere emotion. After I was done here, I was going to call the police, and I was never going near him again. I moved through dark hallways lit by red exit signs until I found the room I remembered. The equipment was all still inside, and after waiting and listening for another few minutes, I dared enter and turn on the lights. Quickly, I moved to the biohazard container. A whole pile of used syringes lay within, and I could see neon green glimmering in most of them. I picked out a handful and threw them in my bag. I could take them to someone for analysis later. Next, I found a stack of waivers. No, not waivers. They were contracts, exactly as the doctor had said. They were written in odd archaic legalese, and while I could recognize some language pertaining to learning skills, and to amenities provided that mentioned a bed, a table, and a sink, the rest made no sense to me. What the hell was I reading? Why had I been asked to sign this, stuffing them in my bag as well? I moved on to the crown jewel of the room, the virtual reality helmet. Lifting it high, I examined it closely. I looked for cords, but there were none. I opened the back panel, but it only contained a few batteries to power the lights on the outside. Prying at a bit of the outer hardware, I popped off some pieces that looked like computer chips. They weren't connected to anything. None of it was connected to anything. The helmet, the goggles, the ear covers, it was all fake. It was nothing. The helmet looked like a B-movie prop because it was. Then what the hell had I experienced? I had absolutely gone somewhere. I had spent 7 months starving and thirsting, and sleepless. I'd learned an entire field of study in 3 minutes. Or had I just imagined it all as part of some sort of mental experience? Of course, it wasn't virtual reality at all. There had to be some sort of new super drug. The neon green liquid would hold the answer. Clutching my bag, I readied myself to escape the building, which meant another encounter with that man in the basement. I stepped quietly down the stairwell, but he already knew I was there. He watched me with icy eyes as I passed. I paused below the window, wondering if I could really just leave him here. He said, with genuine hate, "Your suffering will be legendary." I turned, locking eyes with him. His anger turned slowly into an understanding grin. Oh my, it already was, wasn't it? His mocking laugh followed me as I climbed out the window and ran for my car. I didn't call the police. Something about him had been far too strange. I just sat at home the rest of that night, catching what nightmare-filled sleep I could, and then brought some of the neon green liquid to a coworker the next day for analysis. Then, I did my best to try to get on with my life. My sleep was tortured. I was constantly on edge, and I was fearful at random times. But I finally had a job. My landlord was coming around asking for rent. I told him I'd found a position and was about to get paid, but he reminded me that I was already extremely behind and very close to eviction. No problem, it was almost payday, except when payday came the next week, I opened my paycheck to find a statement for $0. Of course, I went to see my boss, who looked at me with confusion. He said, "Didn't you read your hiring contract? Training is unpaid, and you're training for the first month." I had not read that. No, I tried to argue, but he dismissed me. I went home with a gnawing sense that my life was about to implode. When I faced my landlord and told him it had been another few weeks, he grew angry, and he told me I was done. I argued that he couldn't do that, but he told me to run my lease, and he took my key right from my hand. What else could I do? I wandered onto the street and found a bench to sit on. I had no money to know where to go. How the hell could this have happened to me? I had always tried to work hard and do my best, but now I was sitting on a park bench, homeless. The world seemed to know somehow. Every dog that passed barked at me as if it was afraid. I got up and tried to go to a church for charity, but the door wouldn't open for me. Strangers seemed to get chills if I stood too close to them. I simply felt wrong, and somehow, I wanted to blame it all on experimental education. It didn't take many days like that for my boss to fire me. When I asked why, he said, "No, your work is fine. You just smell, and you look like shit. You come off like a homeless guy. I am homeless because you're not paying me, asshole." I shot back, finally snapping. "Why should I pay you?" He asked him. "I'll just keep getting 3 months off people, since they can learn the skills to do this job in 3 minutes. Just like you, you're completely replaceable." He made a noise of disgust and stalked off after threatening to call security if I wasn't out in 10 minutes. He knew about experimental education. He knew I'd gone. Hell, I gathered my few things in a box, wondering how my life had come apart so forcefully. On my way out of the building, my coworker stopped me. "Hey man, you know that ground stuff you gave me?" I took a look at it. "It doesn't matter anymore," I told him, too overwhelmed to care. He briefly gripped the edge of my box. "You should be careful with that stuff. It's lethal." I froze. Lethal? They use those chemicals on executions. He insisted, pulling my box away from him. I shook my head. "I was injected with that. I'm still alive." "No, wait. This stuff induces brain death almost immediately. You need to have a counter injection in like 3 minutes or less, or you're not coming back." Wait, 3 minutes? That knocked me out of my darkness. I told him I'd be careful. Then, I hurried to my car. Something was snapping into place for me. Experimental education hadn't been using virtual reality at all. The truth was far darker and more twisted than I could have ever guessed. I drove back to their office building and waited until I saw the doctor and nurses leave. The back window had been hastily patched with wood, but I removed it with my tire iron. Then, I slipped inside. The strange and frightening man was still chained within. His head was leaking fresh blood from a recent wound, but he was smiling as I approached. I held my contract in my hand. "I wrote it." "Good," he said with a grin. "What did you learn?" "Now that I finally understand what they're actually doing, the archaic language makes sense." I told him, "They're killing people. They killed me, at least for a little while. Then they brought me back with a counter injection, but I signed a contract for the experience I would have well dead." I pointed at his head wound. "The red pin, it was filled with your blood, wasn't it?" His grin widened into a smirk. "You're beginning to understand." "Those assholes," I replied. filled with equal parts admiration, disgust, awe, and hopelessness. They actually managed to commoditize the human afterlife. They actually managed to turn hell into a product. Just another way to make us even more expendable. He nodded, his eyes filled with animal fire. If I free you, I said slowly, the same fire raging in me. What will you do? I'll kill them, he replied, genuine in his anger. Then I'll kill their masters, and their masters, right up the chain, until I reach the true monsters. I will topple this world one brutally torturous murder at a time. I will burn it all down, and sink humanity into a lawless age of darkness. I didn't know to look for the key to his chance. In a sense, I already had it. I touched my contract to the metal links, and they rusted away. All I had to say was, good. My girlfriend talks in her sleep. My girlfriend talks in her sleep. At first, it was cute and hilarious to tell her what she said. It was harmless nonsense. The sky is folding, or we need to raise the ground. We talked the next day about if she remembered her dream, but she never did. I wish I knew what she meant by we need to raise the ground. Some context. Our nightly routine is for us to start out cuddling, and then give up once it gets too hot. Then we're usually both on our sides, back to back. She would fall asleep before I do, and so I would hear the full range of her nightly musings. Honestly, at first I was eager to hear what she said. It was always funny to tell her, and our friends when she would say while deep in the throes of REM. But now I'm done. I prefer she not talk anymore. How am I going to sleep after what happened last night? Last night around 11 p.m. she was asleep, and I was still up reading, back to back. I hear her mumble something under her breath. I couldn't quite make out what she said, but I lean over from my book to peek at her face, and she is sleeping soundly. I return to my book, get absorbed back into its pages. At some point I fall asleep. Next thing I know, I'm woken up by my girlfriend talking at full volume. I'd open my eyes, and at some point in the night both of us have turned to lay face to face. My girlfriend's eyes are wide open. She is staring right at me, mere inches from my face, but her eyes are vacuous, like she is looking through me. These eyes, man. It's like she was straining to widen them as much as possible. Those are the eyes I fell in love with, and right now they are scaring the absolute piss out of me. My heart rate skyrockets, and chock full of adrenaline I throw off the covers and jump out of bed. Looking at her, her eyes follow me like a painting, but her body stays still. For 1 second I decided that my booklight was keeping her awake, and what she had said was, "Can you please turn that off?" Now out of bed and looking at her, she's not right. Her body hasn't moved, but her eyes dart from looking at me to looking around the room. I dare to ask her, "Are you alright?" No response. Those eyes look at me when I speak, though they are now deadlocked, looking right into my eyes. Her breathing hasn't changed. That is a sleep breathing for sure. That's when, while looking right at me, she says in a too deep voice, "Come back to bed, dearie." My girlfriend has never called me dearie before. We have Patnam sure. What they range from pumpkin, baby, to cupcake. Dearie sounds like something my grandmother would call me. I decide I'll get more information before I climb back into bed with a potentially possessed girlfriend. "Are you awake, sweating?" No response. The eyes dart from me to the wall, to the door, and then the ceiling. I'm about to nope out of the room when her wide open eyes roll to the back of her head. The white from those eyes stands out in the dim radiance of the booklight. No pupils in sight, she insists. Of course I'm awake, come back to bed, with a subtle tap of the fingers on the comforter. Looking at her fingers now, I'm starting to come around. She's never sleepwalked before. Surely she is awake now if she is moving her hands, while looking at her fingers as though she is pretending to have control. They are all going in different directions. One finger pointing straight down and the others to the side. Those hands are not my girlfriend's hands. They are simulating normal movement as best they can. Though, I say, I'm going to get a drink of water, baby. Be right back. Can I bid you anything? Well, my normally agreeable and sweet girlfriend decides I'm not allowed to leave. As serious as cancer, she says in that too deep horror voice. "Take one step out of that door, and I will rip out your throat and shit down your neck." Shocked but understanding the importance of not letting this beast know I am in trouble, I reply, "As interesting as a proposition as that is, I think I'm going to." And thinking quickly, I grab my water bottle from the nightstand. This doesn't please my girlfriend as she decides to start screaming and fingering her way towards me. It is a supernatural scream, so high-pitched and bird-like I feel as though my neighbors 3 houses down were going to ask us if they heard that last night. As fast as I can muster, I unscrew the lid and douse her in water. Like I knew what I was doing, her eyes close, her garbled appendages normalize, and she is back asleep. I'm going to sleep on the couch for a while, maybe forever. She'll understand when she's awake. Okay, something terrifying happened last night, and I just need to tell someone. I was sitting in my recliner last night, which is by the window, when I heard a man's voice just outside whisper say, "Yo, you still awake?" I am a strong guy and do have the means to protect myself, but in my vulnerable state I felt true fear. I froze for a few seconds, then got up and looked out the window, but saw nothing. My house is in a heavily wooded area, so they could have got to the forest before I got to the window. The blinds were closed but not shut, So gang, just freaked me out. I am going to adopt a dog today from the animal shelter, or in calls I need a friend to watch my back and give me that heads up when he hears them the next time they come. However, I just want to say it's rare I feel every hair on my body rise in terror. Thank you guys so much for watching. I know this was a long one, but I really appreciate you guys for staying tuned and watching the entire thing. If you enjoyed it, make sure to hit a like. And if you want to make sure you never miss one of these, hit a sub. See you tomorrow.